Okay. And then I would have to stop the transcription. Now the recording is on, and with the assurance that at least most of you can hear my voice and see the slides, let's proceed. I probably mentioned in the last meeting that today's topic is usually the most challenging. But well, I don't know. I don't want to call it any of these names because let's just say that it's the densest topic in this in the semester. That is what we're going to do today is a bit more than what we will do in any other single class. So I want you guys to pay very close attention. And I am going to be very careful as I teach so that we get everything step by step. All right. So today is deductive reasoning. We are starting the second half of the semester. So welcome to the second half of the semester. The first half of the preparation, where we studied concepts in language and meaning. We studied statements that are not logical. We learned to identify passages that are argumentative or not. We did all of those things in preparation. Now it's time to study arguments. So we begin by saying that arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms. They are also called reasoning or syllogisms. In fact, the three terms are used interchangeably. So you can either refer to arguments or reasoning or syllogism. They are all the same. And then the two major categories of reasoning or argument or syllogism are deductive and inductive. So these are the two major categories. Whenever you are making an argument, it's either you are making a deductive argument or an inductive one. Anything outside the two is a fallacy. We'll just say it is rhetoric. It's not an argument. It's just entertainment or noise. We also have causal reasoning, but causal reasoning is a form of inductive reasoning. You're going to see that in 2 weeks' time, because next week is inductive reasoning. Okay. Now, we begin with deductive reasoning, also called deductive argument, deductive syllogism. Now, here is the thing. This is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. That tells you that for inductive argument, that's the other kind of argument, the relationship is not logical. So for deductive reasoning, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical. For inductive, it's not logical. That's a major difference between the two. And as a result of this, as a result of the logical nature of the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, this reasoning, deductive reasoning, is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. It permits only one conclusion. In mathematics, 2 plus 2 permits only one conclusion. 2 plus 2 doesn't permit two conclusions, it's 1, it's 4. You can't say 2 plus 2 is 4 and 2 plus 2 is also 5. For deductive reasoning, which is derived from mathematics, it's only one conclusion. Example, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, therefore Kofi is mortal. All men are mortal, Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. If you look at premises 1, 2, and the conclusion, you see that there are 3 concepts. The first concept is men or man. Men and man are the same concept. The second concept is being mortal. Mortality is the second concept. And then the third concept is Kofi. Or let's just say that an example of concept 1 is Kofi, but I just see it as the third concept. Between premises 1 and 2, men occurred twice. Mortal occurred once. Kofi occurred once. The concept of men occurred twice between premises 1 and 2. The concept of mortal once. The concept of Kofi once. So you have men twice, mortal once, Kofi once. That is when you don't know the conclusion. So if you're asked to reach a conclusion, the conclusion has to be made up of those concepts that have not occurred twice. So men have occurred twice. So that means the conclusion should be made up of mortal and Kofi. When you make up the conclusion with Kofi and mortal, then all the 3 concepts have occurred twice. It means that between premises 1, 2, and conclusion, men is twice, mortal is twice, Kofi is twice. The 3 concepts have occurred twice. So that is why we say that the deductive argument is derived from mathematics. Deductive argument is mathematics. It's a completely mathematical operation. And as for knowing which concept is going to be the subject and which one is going to be the predicate of the conclusion, a look at premises 1 and 2 will tell you whether it is Kofi or mortal that will be the subject of the conclusion and whether it is which one will be the predicate of the conclusion. So the whole thing, the whole business of reaching the conclusion here is a mathematical business. That's why we call it deduction. You just deduce. You are deducing the conclusion in a mathematical way from the premises. All you did was to look at premise 1, look at premise 2, get Kofi from premise 2, get mortal from premise 1, and just connect the 2 of them with a verb. And that's the conclusion. That's why we call it deduction. Very simple. It's not complex, and it's purely mathematical. When you go to inductive argument, you see something different. That is why we say it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. You can't have 2 conclusions. It's just like 2 plus 2. The conclusion can only be 1. I mean, the conclusion can only be 4. So reading the bottom of the slide, you cannot change or modify the conclusion. For example, you can't say, for example, Kofi is immortal or a fire cabinet is mortal. There's no immortal in the premises. There's no fire cabinet in the premises. So that's why it's called deductive reasoning. You are just deducing the conclusion from the premises. Now, in order to understand deductive reasoning better, we need to make some clarifications. Yes, Samuel, your hand is raised.
Yes, sir. So, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Please, for the premise 1, you did mention that a man appeared twice and the mortal appeared twice. But as for me, I see only one man and one mortal, and I'm just asking how is it like that? Please, if I may ask.
Between premises 1 and 2. Between premises 1 and 2.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so between premises 1 and 2, you see 2 men. The man in premise 2 is the same concept. It doesn't matter whether it's a plural or single. there is men in premise 1 and there is man in premise 2. So the concept appears twice. And then there is one mortal in premise 1 and there is no mortal in premise 2. And then there is one Kofi in premise 2, there's no Kofi in premise 1. So what it means is that the premises are giving you two concepts of men, one concept of Kofi, and one concept of mortal. So you are going to form the conclusion with the single occurring concepts. That's why it's called deduction. And then the nature of the premises already tell you which of them is the subject of the conclusion. It is Kofi. Because premise 2 is alleging that Kofi is a man. So that means the conclusion is going to make a conclusion about Kofi, not about mortal or, Okay. So wait, there is another raised hand here. I'm coming. Okay, so that's Samuel's hand. All right. So now, in order to understand how deductive arguments work, and of course, we're going to be doing some quite complicated operations with deductive arguments. We need to start understanding certain concepts. One of them is reference and attribute classes. Reference and attribute classes. In English grammar, you know that a sentence is divided into the subject and the predicate. When we were doing definitions, we said we don't call the subject subject, we call it definiendum, and then the predicate, we call it definiens. But when we are dealing with arguments, the subject is called the reference class. The reference class. And the predicate is called the attribute class. There's a technical reason for those terms. The reference class is that part of the sentence, that the sentence is referring to. For instance, all men are mortal. All men are mortal. All men is a reference class. The sentence is referring to the reference class for convenience when we are performing some operations, some logical operations. Since the sentence is referring to all men, we call all men the reference class. And then our mortal is the attribute class. Now, our mortal is called attribute class because it is attributing something to, or saying something about the reference class. Okay. So the subject is called the reference class because the sentence refers to that, and then they call the attribute to the reference class. Something. Mortal is an. Okay. When you come to reference class, we have two kinds of reference classes. We have finite and infinite reference classes. The infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. That's why we call it the infinite reference class. It refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. Example, all men, no man, any man. All men, no man, any man. It is a class of uncountable items. You cannot count the items in the infinite reference class When you say all men is uncountable. The same with no man or any man. These are classes of uncountable items. That's why we call it the infinite reference class. On the other hand, the finite reference class refers to countable and particular members of a class, anything between 0% and 100%. Example, some men, 80% of men, 5 men, all the men, few men, almost all the men. When you say all the men, remember that all the men is different from all men. All men is a class of uncountable items, but all the men, with a definite article between, is a class of countable items. You can count all the men. Now, all the men is located. It has a location. For instance, all the men in this class, all the men in this university, all the men in this department, they are all countable. Okay, so just give me 2 seconds. Let me get some water for my cough. Okay, so we've made a difference between the infinite reference class, the class of uncountable items, for instance, all men, no man, and then the finite reference class, the class of countable items, for instance, some men, 80% of men, 5 men, and so forth. Now, we need to distinguish between universal and particular statements. Universal and particular statements. Statements containing the infinite reference class are called universal statements, while those containing finite reference classes are called particular statements. Example of universal statements, all men are mortal. Universal statements, they contain the infinite reference class, all men are mortal. Example of particular statements containing the finite reference class, some men drink alcohol. Okay, give me some seconds. Okay, so we have said the universal statements are those containing the infinite reference class. The particular statements are those containing the finite reference class. Now let's do some exercises. Which statements are universal and which are particular? This table is three-legged. This table is three-legged. So is it universal or particular? Someone can answer that. Your microphone. Please come again. Isaac. Yeah, I was calling you. I'll call you later. All right, sir. Okay, so this table is three-legged. Someone can answer that right away. Universal or particular?
Particular.
Okay, so tables can be sat on. Tables can be sat on. Tables can be
universal.
Universal. Universal.
Universal. Okay, then the third one, James and Mary passed the examination. James and Mary passed the examination. Say it again.
Particular.
Yeah, so it's particular. And then all visitors should be treated with respect. All visitors should be treated with respect.
Universal. Universal.
Okay, okay, good. So now let's move on. Yeah, so now let's look at validity. Validity. Now, validity is an important topic. Let's navigate it very carefully. An argument is valid. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. So that's a valid argument if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. Now, when you say 2 plus 2, they make a certain conclusion necessary, and that conclusion follows with certainty, which is 4. So that's how you know validity. Anything that doesn't have full certainty is not valid. Anything that has shortage of certainty is not a valid argument. So a valid argument is something that has certainty. 2 plus 2 is 4. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. So inductive arguments are strictly not valid. Inductive arguments are strictly not valid. Only deductive arguments, good deductive arguments, are valid. And deductive arguments are purely mathematical arguments where the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical, as we mentioned. So you can refer to the example we had. All men are mortal. Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. So this is valid because the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. So we call it a valid argument. Okay. Now let's compare that to an inductive argument. This is an inductive argument by comparison. You can see premises 1, 2, and conclusion. Premise 1, 95% of men are honest. Premise 2, Peter is a man. Conclusion, Peter is honest. Now, premise 1 is mentioning 95% of men as being honest. So that implies that we are not sure the rest of the 5% are honest. And then premise 2 says Peter is a man. And the conclusion says Peter is honest. Now, you can see that more than one conclusion is possible. Possible conclusion 1, Peter is honest. Possible conclusion 2, Peter is not honest. Since there is no information about where Peter belongs, whether Peter is in the 95% or the other 5%, the two conclusions are So this argument is generating more than one possible conclusion. That's why we call it an inductive argument. Once you see that from your analysis, an argument is generating more than one possible conclusion, then that argument is an inductive argument. It is only a deductive argument that generates only one possible conclusion. Okay, so now let's look at another thing we need to know when dealing with deductive arguments. Now, all arguments have have hidden conditionals. There are two ways of looking at arguments. You can look at an argument in a categorical way or look at an argument in a conditional way. All arguments have hidden conditionals. Now, look at the categorical statements of premise 1. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. That's a categorical statement. If you convert it to a conditional statement, it will read as follows. If something is a man, then it is mortal. So the categorical version is all men are mortal. The conditional version is if something is a man, then it's mortal. So that's how to convert a categorical statement into a conditional statement. You use if and then. So all men, instead of saying all men, you say if something is a member of this class, if something is a member of this class, if something is a man, then it is mortal. That's how to convert it. If something is a member of this class called all men, then that thing is mortal. That's how you convert it to a conditional statement. And when you convert premise 1 of the example we've seen into a conditional statement, you see the argument below. Premise 1, if something is a man, then it's mortal. Premise 2, Peter is a man. Therefore, Peter is mortal. It helps you to see the argument more clearly. It gives you a clearer view of the argument. If something is a man, then it's mortal. Peter is a man. Therefore, Peter is mortal. Yeah, so is it Hannah? Hannah is raising her hand. Yeah, Hannah, your hand is raised.
Sir. Yes. Please, I'm confused about the categorical argument and then the conditional this one.
Yeah, so we're talking about, we're not yet talking about categorical and conditional arguments. We're still talking about categorical and conditional statements, converting a categorical statement to a conditional version. So a categorical statement is, now we're saying that you have to learn to change it to a conditional statement. To change it to a conditional statement, you have to use the terms if and then. If and then. And when you want to use if and then, you look at the first part of the statement, all men are mortal. So instead of saying all men, you say if something is a man, then that thing is mortal. If something is a man, then it is mortal. That's how to change a categorical statement into a conditional statement. So it is something you have to go and learn to do. Okay. Samuel.
Sir.
Yes.
Please, for me, in order to recapitulate everything on my side, can I say that any sentence that that we can find if and then it should be considered as a conditional statement directly, or?
Yeah, I'm coming to that.
Okay.
There are some statements you can convert to a conditional, and there are some statements you cannot convert to a conditional. So we need to know the two kinds of statements.
Okay, see.
So I think that is where we are going to right now.
Okay.
So let me see. So we're coming to that. I've just seen that that was the slide I was adding in the first in the first 20 minutes of the class. I was adding 2 slides about that so that because I've been teaching this for the past it's almost 10 years. But just today, I decided to add 2 slides about that particular aspect so that it will teach students how to convert categorical statements to conditional statements, how to even know which statements are convertible to conditionals, because it's not all statements that are convertible. And all these things are not even in the textbook that is recommended. They are rather in the one in the bookshop, the Kingdom bookshop, the big one. So because of all those shortcomings, students have been having difficulty. So what I do is to get these extra information and then build them into my slides to get these things sorted out. So converting a categorical statement into a conditional, let's look at the categorical version. Now, so let's look at this. This is the slide I was building a few minutes ago. So there is a difference between major and minor premises. Now, up till now, we've been using an example that shows 2 premises. One of those 2 premises I see as a major premise. The second one I see as a minor one. The major premise is that premise that is convertible to a conditional, and it is usually a confirmable statement. Now, we're going to do confirmable statements next week, but I want to bring it here because it has to help you to convert statements to conditionals. A confirmable statement is a statement that is not directly verifiable. A confirmable statement is a statement that you cannot directly verify. Example, no politician steps down from power unless forced to do so. No politician steps down from power unless forced to do so. You can't verify that because it's talking about all politicians. So there is no place to go for verification. Something you cannot directly verify. Look at the second example. All men are mortal. All men are mortal. You can't directly verify that all men are mortal. You can only verify that John is mortal, Kofi is mortal. But you can't verify all men being mortal because some men have not even been born. So these statements, we call them confirmable statements. You can only confirm them by verifying verifiable statements. Now look at the verifiable ones. The minor premise is usually a verifiable statement. Peter is a man. You can verify that. John is a politician. You can verify that. So these are what we call verifiable statements. So they are the kind of statements that are used as what I call the minor premise. So the major premise is usually a confirmable statement. You can't verify it directly, except through verifiable statements. And then the minor premise is usually a verifiable statement. Peter is a man, John is a politician. Now, when you go back to our first example, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. Premise 1 is a confirmable statement. All men are mortal. You can't verify it directly. premise 2 is a verifiable statement. Kofi is a mortal. You can verify that. The only thing you can do about premise 1, is to reach a conclusion about it with premise 2. So you can verify premise 2, but you cannot verify premise 1. Premise 1 is too general for you to verify. So that's the kind of statement you can convert to a conditional. You cannot convert premise 2 to a conditional because it's verifiable. What you can convert to a conditional is premise 1 because it's not verifiable. It's a confirmable statement. So when you get home, you do some experimentation with them. Yeah, Samuel, your hand is raised.
Yes, sir. Doctor, please.
Yeah.
All men are mortal. All men are mortal. That means it's a unverifiable statement, and at the same time, it's a major one.
Yeah, well, that's what. Yeah, that
Yes.
is the kind of statement we use for the major premise.
Okay. Okay, sir.
Yes,
Okay,
that's the
thank you.
kind of statement we use for the major premise. The confirmable statements, those kinds of statements which you can't verify. That's what we use for the premise 1.
Service, you are mute.
Okay, so I'm trying to get these things simplified so that so what I'm doing is to give you the ideas so that you go home and get them sorted out. So premise 1 is what I call the major premise. Why? Because the statement is a confirmable statement. It is not directly verified. It attributes something to a class. And when you look at it, you see that you can convert it to a conditional. All men are mortal. If you are a man, then you are immortal. So that's why I call it the major premise. You convert it to a conditional statement. And it is what we call a confirmable statement. It's not directly verifiable. That is why you can even convert it to a conditional. You can't convert verifiable statements to a conditional. So you can convert premise 2 to a conditional. You can't say if you are Kofi, then you are a man, because there is only one Kofi and you are not the person. Now, the kind of statement you can convert to a conditional is a statement that is saying something about a class of people you can belong to. A class of people you can belong to, or a class of items that you can be part of. So when we say all men are mortal, if you are a man, it means you can be part of that class. If you are part of that class, then you have that quality of being mortal. That's the kind of statement you can convert to a conditional. So I want you to understand that right now, because you are the first class I'm giving this particular clarification, and it is nowhere in the course or in the textbook, in any of the textbooks. It just occurred to my mind today when I was doing my exercises. Okay, so let's move on, because with this idea right now, it will be easier for you to perform certain operations.
Good afternoon, doctor.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon.
Please, are you in the office today?
Not exactly in the office. In another location. So by 5 minutes to 4.
5 minutes to 4.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be around.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so let's get down to where we stopped previously. So this is where we started discussing conditionality. We said there are two ways of looking at arguments, the categorical and conditional ways. And we said all arguments have hidden conditionals. The categorical statement, for instance, all men are mortal. You can convert it to a conditional statement. If something is a man, then it's mortal. And then you can change the categorical statement of premise 1 to a conditional statement. So premise 1, instead of all men are mortal, we say if something is a man, then it's mortal. If something is a man, then it's mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So let's move on. Now let's replace it with symbols. Categorical version. All men are mortal. All A's are B's. So we replace men with A, we replace mortal with B. And then we replace Peter with X. All men are mortal, all A's are B's. Peter is a man, X is an A. Peter is mortal, X is a B. So man is A, mortal is B, Peter is X. All A's are B's, X is an A, X is a B. So you can see how the argument works. All A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B. Look at the conditional version. If something is a man, then it's mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So if A, then B. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. Sometimes we just abbreviate it. If A, then B. A, therefore B. Okay, so we've done this major and minor premises. I think it is at a later section. Before the next class, I will try to shift it upwards. Okay. So we had said that only the major premise is convertible to a conditional because it's a confirmable statement. Only confirmable statements are convertible to a conditional. So whenever you look at an argument, you should know the premise that you can convert to a conditional. If you're able to convert any of the premises to a conditional, then that premise is the major premise. That's what I call the major premise. I'm the only one who has generated that distinction, major and minor premises. So if you tell any other lecturer about major and minor premises, the person will just be looking at you. But I've generated those distinctions to clarify you the extra mile so that you don't face the hurdles, confusion, and that other students have been facing when they learn about deductive reasoning. So once you have identified the major premise and the minor one, then it sets the stage for an easier operation, as we're going to see later. Okay, so having gotten an idea about that, let's move on to the next stage. Now we are going to see the value of what we just did. Antecedents and consequence. Now remember what we did about the reference class and the attribute class. The reference class and the attribute class. If we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, in other words, if we are converting the major premise to a conditional, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. if we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, in other words, the major premise, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. Example, all A are B, or if A, then B. The reference class in this case, A, is the antecedent, and the attribute class in this case, B, is the consequent. So A is the antecedent, and B is the consequence. So that tells you that antecedent and consequent do not apply to the minor premise. Antecedent and consequent do not apply to the minor premise. You can't convert the minor premise into a conditional before even finding out the antecedent and the consequent. So what we're saying is concerning only the major premise. The first part of the major premise is the antecedent, and the second part is the consequent. All A are B, or if A, then B. A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. Any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. And any statement referring to B will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Example, X is an A, affirms the antecedent. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is a B, affirms the consequent. X is not a B, denies the consequent. Now let's begin with affirming the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is an A that affirms the antecedent. Therefore, X is a B. You can see that the minor premise is affirming the antecedent. Because of that, we say that the whole argument, the entire argument, affirms the antecedent. So you can say that this is an example of an argument that affirms the antecedent. Denying the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is not an A. That denies the antecedent. Therefore, X is not a B. Now, because the minor premise is denying the antecedent, for that reason, we say that the whole argument denies the antecedent. So this is an example of an argument that denies the antecedent. You say it is an argument that denies the antecedent. Mensa, your hand is raised. Mensa.
Sorry, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an argument that denies the antecedent. That's how we put it. Affirming the consequent. All A's are B's, X is a B. That affirms the consequence. Therefore, X is an A. We say this is an argument that affirms the consequent because the minor premise is affirming the consequent. Denying the consequent. All A's are B's, X is not a B. That denies the consequent. Therefore, X is not an A. This is an argument that denies the consequent. Now, let's look at the rule for deductive reasoning. We have just one rule for deductive reasoning. We only affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. We only affirm the antecedent or deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. That means any statement saying something about the antecedent If it is affirming the antecedent, then it leads to a valid conclusion. If it is denying the antecedent, it will lead to a fallacy. And then any statement saying something about the consequent, if it is affirming the consequent, it will lead to a fallacy. But if it is denying the consequent, it will lead to a valid conclusion. Okay, so let's see examples. All A's are B's. X is an A, affirms the antecedent. Therefore, X is a B. We say this is a valid argument. All A's are B's. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. Therefore, X is not a B. We say this is not a valid argument. This argument is fallacious. Let's convert it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian. This affirms the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is an African. We say this is a valid argument. If all Ghanaians are Africans, and you say Peter is a Ghanaian, then definitely Peter is an African. It is a valid argument. The second example, all Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, which denies the antecedent. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We say it's not a valid argument. Now, why is it not a valid argument? You say all Ghanaians are Africans, and Peter is not a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is not an African. The reason why it's a fallacy is that if Peter is not a Ghanaian, that is not enough reason for you to say he's not an African. What if he's a Cameroonian or a South African? The fact that Peter is not a Ghanaian is not enough reason to say that he's not an African. So you can reach a valid conclusion by affirming the antecedent, but you land in a fallacy if you deny the antecedent. Now, there is a technical reason for it. Now, that technical reason is not in any of your textbooks, but I have invented it and I'm going to show you. I'll be showing you with diagrams why in those diagrams you see the relationship between Ghana and Africa. And then you see how antecedents play out. When you affirm the antecedent, you see why it becomes correct. When you deny the antecedent, you see why it becomes wrong. Now, this is the technicality. The consequent, which is Africans, is always a larger class of denotations or members compared to the antecedent. The consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. The consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. So when you say all Ghanaians are Africans, you are implying that Africans contain all Ghanaians and possibly more. And possibly more. That possibly more is the reason why if you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore he's not an African, the argument is not convincing enough because there are possibly more in Africa than Ghanaians. So in logic, the consequent, by virtue of being in the position of a consequent, contains the antecedents and possibly more. So when you deny something of membership in the antecedent, you have not successfully denied it of membership in the consequent because you don't know whether it is still in the consequent, although it is not in the antecedent. So the consequent Africans contain more members than the antecedent Ghanaians. When you deny something of membership in a smaller class, you have not denied it of membership in a larger class. Especially if the smaller class is inside the larger class. But when you deny something of membership in a larger class containing all the members of a small class, you have automatically denied it of membership in a smaller class. So we're going to see that one later. Now, let's look at the diagrams. Here we have two boxes. The bigger box is the consequence. The smaller box is the antecedent. You can see that the antecedent box is completely inside the consequent box. That implies that anything inside the antecedent is also in the consequent. So if you say something is a member of the antecedent, automatically it is a member of the consequent. That is why when you affirm the antecedent as a way of affirming the consequent, the argument to be valid. If you say all antecedents are consequent, X is an antecedent. Therefore, X is a consequent. You are right. But if you say all antecedents are also consequents, which is correct, X is not an antecedent, therefore X is not a consequent. That argument is not valid. The fact that X is not an antecedent doesn't mean that it is not a consequent, because there are other parts of the consequence outside the antecedent. You can confirm that X is a consequent by confirming it is an antecedent, because everything inside the antecedent is inside the consequent. But you cannot confirm that something is outside the consequent simply because it is outside the antecedent. If it is not in the antecedent, that's not enough reason to say it is not in the consequent. You can see the two diagrams. The consequent is bigger than the antecedent. If something is not in the antecedent, that is not a guarantee that it is not in the consequent. It could be in any other part of the consequent. So if you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African, that's not a valid argument. Now look at the two diagrams, Africans and Ghanaians. Now you can see that the larger box is Africans, the smaller box is Ghanaians. All Ghanaians are Africans. That is correct, because you can see that everything in the Ghanaian box is in the African box. If you say Peter is a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is an African, that's correct. But if you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African, that's not valid. Peter could be in any other part of the African box. He could be in the South African box, he could be in the Cameroonian box, he could be in the Kenyan box. So you can see why denying the antecedent will lead you to an invalid conclusion, a conclusion that doesn't follow with certainty. So we're talking about logic. So if something is not in a Ghanaian box, it could still be in the African box. So you don't confirm that something is not African simply because it's not Ghanaian. But you can confirm that something is African just by confirming it is the Ghanaian, because everything in the Ghanaian is in the African box. Okay. So with this explanation, let's look at 4 kinds of deductive arguments. 4 kinds of deductive arguments. Number 1 is modus ponens. Modus ponens is an argument that affirms the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. So this is an argument that affirms the antecedent. All Ghanaians are Africans, Peter is a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is an African. It affirms the antecedent. We call it modus ponens. Any argument that affirms the antecedent is called a modus ponens. So, and we said affirming the antecedent will lead you to a valid conclusion. If all Ghanaians are Africans and Peter is a Ghanaian, then definitely Peter is an African. Then let's look at the fallacy of denying the antecedent. The fallacy of denying the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is not an A, therefore X is not a B. We said it's not valid. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African. It's not a valid argument. Peter could possibly be a Cameroonian. Modus tollens. Modus tollens is an argument that denies the consequent. An argument that denies the consequent. All A are B, X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. We say it is a valid argument. An argument that denies the consequent is valid. All Ghanaians are Africans. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. It's a valid argument. Now let's go back to the box and see why. Now the Ghanaian box is inside the African box. All Ghanaians are Africans. If you say Michael is not an African, then there's no way he can be a Ghanaian. Because the Ghanaian box is in the African box. If he's not an African, then he's not a Ghanaian. So you can confirm that Michael is not a Ghanaian by simply confirming that he's not an African. Just confirming that he's not an African is enough to know that he's not a Ghanaian, because everything in the Ghanaian box is in the African box. Okay, let's look at another example. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana, so Kevin is not studying in the Department of Physics. Now, imagine that we are debating whether Kevin is in the Department of Physics or he's in chemistry. Some people say this, they always see Kevin at physics. And then some other people say that they also see him at chemistry. So there's a debate about which department Kevin belongs. And Kevin is not there to clarify where he belongs. So some people are arguing Kevin is a physics student. Some other people are saying that he should be a chemistry student. And then somebody decides to go to the registry to ask whether Kevin is enrolled for physics or for chemistry. And then the registry goes through all the records. And then the registry announces that Kevin is not enrolled at University of Ghana. Now, once the registry has announced that Kevin is not enrolled at University of Ghana, what happens to the argument about whether he's in physics or chemistry? Those arguments are quashed. If he's not enrolled at the University of Ghana, then he cannot be in physics. He cannot be in chemistry. So that is why we say that if Michael is not an African, then Michael cannot be a Ghanaian, because everything in the Ghanaian box is inside the African box. So it is enough to know he's not a Ghanaian by just knowing he's not an African. That's why we say that denying the consequent in order to deny the antecedent leads to a valid conclusion. Remember that consequents are larger than antecedents. Consequents are a larger class of items than the antecedent. So if you say something is not in the consequent, which contains everything in the antecedent, then automatically that thing is not in the antecedent. So when you are talking about the antecedents, you can confirm that something in the antecedent is in the consequent by just confirming it is part of the antecedent. But if you deny that something is in the antecedent, you have not successfully denied that it's in the consequent. Now, that principle works the other way around if you are discussing the consequent. If you affirm that something is in the consequent, you have not successfully affirmed that it's in the antecedent, because it could still be outside the antecedent. But if you deny that something is in the consequent, you have successfully denied it of the consequence. So just remember that the principle works opposite ways for the antecedents and the consequence. The fallacy of affirming the consequent. All A are B, X is a B, therefore X is an A. Now we said affirming the consequent is a fallacy. It will lead you to a fallacy. All Ghanaians are Africans. George is an African, therefore George is a Ghanaian. Why is this a fallacy? We just explained it. The fact that George is an African doesn't confirm he's a Ghanaian, because Africa is larger than Ghana. If he's an African, he could be anywhere in the African box. So just saying he's an African is not enough to say he's a Ghanaian. That's why affirming the consequent, which is larger than the antecedent, cannot lead you to a valid conclusion. The consequent Africans contains a logically larger category of denotations than the antecedent Ghanaians. So the fact that George is an African does not necessarily mean that he's a Ghanaian. He may be a South African or a Kenyan. If we affirm the consequent, we are not sure we can affirm the antecedent. In short, if we affirm the consequent, it will land us in the same uncertainty that we saw in the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent. So affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are the same, they have the same problems. They lead you to uncertainty. Now let's look at another form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Another form of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. All A are not B. X is not a B. Therefore, X is an A. All A are not B. X is not a B. Therefore, X is an A. Now, so the major premise is denying the consequent. The minor premise is also denying the consequent. So can we say the minor premise is affirming the consequent or denying the consequent? Now, if the major premise is denying the consequent and the minor premise also denies the consequent, now remember that in mathematics, two negatives combine to give you a positive. In mathematics, two negatives combine to give you a positive. So if both of them are denying the consequent, it means the minor premise is actually affirming the major premise. So this is a case of affirmation, not denial. So what you say is that this is an argument that affirms the consequent. It's not an argument that denies the consequent, because two negatives combine to give you a positive. Let's put it in words. All human beings are not goats. X is not a goat. Therefore, X is a human being. So the two premises are denying membership of the goat class. The two premises are denying membership of the goat class. The first premise says human beings are not goats. The second one says X is not a goat. Now, you have negativity in premise 1 and negativity in premise 2. So the two negativities give you a positive. What you say is that the minor premise is actually affirming the major premise. So this is an argument that affirms the consequent. And we say that affirming the consequent leads to a fallacy. So this argument is actually a fallacy. All human beings are not goats. X is not a goat. Therefore, X is a human being. Now, yes, all human beings are not goats, but he didn't say that all goats are not human beings. Or rather, he didn't say that it is only human beings that are not goats. Now, if you say X is not a goat, therefore X is a human being, there's a fallacy. Because the argument has not told you that it is only human beings that are not goats. So that's how you confirm that this is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Once it affirms the affirms the consequence. Once it affirms the consequence, there must be a fallacy there at the end of the argument. So this is explanation. Again, not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. Not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. So the fact that X is not a goat does not necessarily make X a human being. X could as well be a cat, giraffe, or tiger. So that wraps up the first two kinds of deductive arguments. You have modus ponens and modus tollens. And then we saw two fallacies. Now, after seeing modus ponens and modus tollens, the third deductive reasoning is a type of deductive reasoning is called the hypothetical syllogism. The hypothetical syllogism. So this is different from affirming the antecedent or the consequent or those things. This is just different. Affirming the antecedent is valid, that's modus ponens. Denying the antecedent is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Affirming the consequent is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Denying the consequent is modus tollens. That's correct. Now, this one is a different kind of argument. It's an argument where the consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. I think I will have to reformulate this writing. The consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. And subsequent premises feature the consequence of their predecessors as their antecedents. Then the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent and the very last consequence.
Yeah, please, the whole show.
Yeah, I have to mute myself to answer a call and get somebody dispatched to do something. So this is a different argument. The consequence of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise. That's how it works. Let's look at it. And then the conclusion pairs the very first consequence and the very last, the very first antecedent and the very last consequence. This is how it works. All A are B, all B are C. You can see that the consequence of the first premise becomes the antecedent of the second one. And the consequence of the second one could also be the antecedent of another one. So you have all A are B, all B are C, all C are D, all D are E, all E are F, all F are G, all G are H, and then it could continue to all Y are Z. And then what the conclusion does, the conclusion pairs together the very first antecedent and the very last consequence. Therefore, all A are C, or therefore all A are Z. The conclusion pairs together the very first antecedent and the very last consequence. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, therefore all Ghanaians are human beings. You could also add more premises. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, all human beings will go to heaven, all those who in heaven will be happy. Therefore, all Ghanaians will be happy. So whatever you reach, you bring together the very first antecedent, the very last consequence, and they form the conclusion. Because there is a chain of deduction. Okay. So we notice that the consequence of the first premise, which is B, becomes the antecedent of the second one. And the antecedent of the second one which is the consequence of the first premise, leads us to a new party, which is C, as its consequence. So any additional subsequent premise will typically fit the consequence of the predecessor as antecedent, so that it is linked conditionally to a fresh party. So let's look at two fallacies of hypothetical syllogisms. So there are two fallacies that can be committed in hypothetical syllogisms. The first fallacy, all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. Instead of all A are C, the conclusion is all C are A. So this is a fallacy, which we will see this fallacy by converting into words. So all Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, therefore all human beings are Ghanaians. So this is where you see why it's a fallacy. All C are A is a fallacy. It's fallacious. All C cannot be A. The fact that all A can be C does not mean that all C can be A. Second hypothetical fallacy. All A are C, not even B, but C. All A are C, all B are C. Therefore, all A are B. So let's look at it carefully. All A are C, all B are C. Therefore, all A are B. Now let's put it in words and see. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans. Therefore, all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So this is why it is fallacious. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans, therefore all Ghanaians are Kenyans. The fact that all A are C and all B are C doesn't mean that all A are B. Or the fact that all Ghanaians are Africans and all Kenyans are Africans doesn't mean that all Ghanaians are Kenyans. The fact that each of them is a C doesn't tell you that they are the same. It's just like saying Emmanuel is the University of Ghana. Samuel is the University of Ghana. Therefore, Emmanuel is the same as Samuel. The fact that the two of them belong to University of Ghana doesn't mean that the two of them is the same. It doesn't even mean they share the same class or office or anything. Belonging to an organization or belonging to a larger class of items does not say anything about the two. Now, it can be true by accident. All Ghanaians are human beings, all Africans are human beings, therefore all Ghanaians are Africans. Now, but now you can see that the conclusion is true, but we did not get the conclusion from the premises. It is not from the premises that we got the conclusion. We know the conclusion before seeing this argument. That is why we know we're true. But we cannot know this conclusion from the premises. The premises themselves are fallacious, so you cannot get this conclusion from the premises because it's a fallacious operation. So the conclusion can be true by accident, but it doesn't mean the argument is correct. Sometimes you can see fallacious arguments with true conclusion. The fact you are seeing a true conclusion doesn't mean the argument is good. Now let's look at the fourth kind of deductive reasoning. We've seen modus ponens, modus tollens, and hypothetical syllogism. The last one is disjunctive syllogism. This is a syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, either or. Now, a premise that has either or a statement that has either or, we call it a disjunctive statement. So the main premise is a disjunctive, an either or statement. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied it the other disjunctive part. Example, either A is true or B is false. Either A is true or B is false. Sorry, either A is true or B is true. That's the correct thing. Either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Either A is true or B is true. If A is true, then B is false. The second example, either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Let's put it in words. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. That's what we call a disjunctive syllogism. It is the fourth kind of deductive argument, and you can see that it's correct. There's nothing you can do about the correctness. So these four kinds of deductive syllogisms are 100% accurate. They are purely mathematical arguments. There is nothing you can do to change the arguments. There is nothing you can do to change their conclusions. Any attempt to change their conclusions will result in a fallacy. Now let's relax with a little exercise. Determine what kind of argument this is. What kind of argument is this? We have seen four kinds of deductive reasoning. Now, which of them is this? Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today, he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today, he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. Now, what kind of argument is it? Yeah, so a hand is raised. Let me see. Wumi, is that Wumi? Wumi, your hand is raised. Semei's hand is raised, and Hannah's hand is raised. Derek's hand is raised. So, Wuni, can we hear from you?
Hello, Doc.
Yes.
It is a valid argument because it affirms the antecedent. That
Affirms
anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house.
Yes.
And then
So
today he passed by my.
Okay, so continue.
Then today he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. So
Yes.
it affirms the antecedent.
Okay. Okay, so what is the antecedent? What is the antecedent?
Hello, sir. The antecedent when you are affirming the argument,
Yes, you said it affirms, it's an argument that affirms the antecedent. So you need to tell us the antecedent.
So that's what I say. The antecedent is what is affirming the argument.
No, the antecedent is a part of one of the premises.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think someone else can come in to continue from where you stopped. Derek or Hannah, do you want to?
Yeah, hello, Doc.
Yes.
Yes, please, the antecedent here. Yes, the antecedent here is the mother's house because it forms part of the town he goes. So the town becomes the consequence. Yeah.
Okay, so you said the antecedent is passing my mother's house.
Yes, please. And then the consequence is the town, goes to town.
Okay, so all right. So Hannah, do you want to say something? Hannah's hand was raised again just a few seconds ago. And then
Doc, please.
It's a fallacy.
No, it's not a fallacy.
Okay, so all right. So all the hands are down. Okay, so the first thing we do is to Derek, your hand is raised again.
Sir, please.
Yes.
Is it the hypothetical synonym?
Yeah, that is what you need to find out because that is how you know what kind of argument it is.
Okay. Okay, please.
So we're using this argument to learn how to determine the types of arguments. And to determine the type, there are a series of steps you need to take. Step one would be to determine which are the premises and which are the conclusions. So where is the conclusion? What is the conclusion? Samuel.
So he went to town.
Okay, so he went to town is the conclusion. So that leaves us with two premises. Now, so we have two premises. Which of the premises is major and which is minor?
Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house is the major premise.
Okay, so how did you know it is the major premise? What operation did you use to find out is the major premise?
Sir, because it is not directly verified.
It is not directly verified. So it's a confirmable statement. That's good. So, and it needs to, it should be convertible to a conditional. In fact, it's almost like a conditional already. Anytime it goes to town, it passes by my mother's house. If you want to make it like a strict conditional, then you just substitute anytime with if. If he goes to town, then he passes by my mother's house. That makes it a strict conditional. But it is already a partial condition. So that makes it the major premise. Derek, your hand is still raised. Let me see. Okay, so now we know the conclusion, we know the premises. And out of the two premises, we now know the major one and the minor one. Now, so that means we need to determine what is the antecedent of the major premise and what is the consequence. What is the antecedent of the major premise and what is the consequence? Same.
So, please, anytime he goes to town, is
Anytime
the
he goes to
antecedent
town.
of the is the antecedent of the major premise.
Okay.
But
Anytime
then
he
in
goes
this
to town.
case, yes, but then in this case, the the antecedent seems to be he passes by my mother's house. So like today he passed by my mother's house. So he went to town. So in this scenario, it seems to be he passes by my mother's house. Okay, I'm not so
So
sure.
the antecedent is passed by my mother's house.
Um, yes, please, I'll stand with that.
Okay. So any other opinion? Is that
Anytime will
Sarah?
yes, please.
Okay, go ahead.
Anytime will be the antecedent, and no, anytime he goes to town is the antecedent. He passes by my mother's house will be the consequence for the major premises.
Okay. So we had said that the major premise is convertible to a conditional. And if you convert the major premise to a conditional, then it will read as if he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. If he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. So whether it is if he goes to town or anytime he goes to town, they are all the same. And we had said that the if part of a conditional statement is the antecedent. The then part is the consequence. So that means that if he goes to town is the antecedent. Then he passes by my mother's house is the consequence. So now having known that, the question is what kind of argument is it? Or to help you reach the conclusion faster, what is the minor premise doing?
Doc, please come again.
What is the minor premise doing?
So he went to town is the minor premise. Minor premise.
Somebody had said that so he went to town is the conclusion.
Please, I want to try.
Or let me even ask, what is the minor premise?
Please, the minor premise is a verifiable statement.
And which one is it? Which one is it?
So today he passed by my mother's house.
No.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah, so what is the minor premise doing? What is it doing in the argument?
Doc, please, it is affirming the consequence.
It is
It is
affirming the
affirming.
consequence.
the
Yeah, Wuni is raising his hand.
Yeah, Doc, the minor premises is confirming the first premises.
No, we don't. We have nothing like confirming first premises.
Okay.
It is either affirming or denying something in the first premise or the major premise.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, Sarah, your hand is still raised. Do you want to tell us exactly what the minor premise is doing?
Um,
minor premises here is affirming the consequence in the major premises.
Okay, so that's it. Somebody, is that Kenyo?
Yes, sir.
Somewhere Kenyo.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
yes,
Yeah, so
please.
somewhere, what do you want to say?
The
Please, I wanted
minor
to say that.
premises here is affirming the consequence in the major premises.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. So somewhere, what did you want to say?
Sir, I wanted to say today he passed by my mother's house. Is affirming. So he went to town.
Yeah, so you went to town has a name. It has a technical name.
Yeah.
Yeah, so already three or four people have said that the minor premise is affirming the consequence. And affirming the consequence, according to what we said, is what? Is an invalid argument. So that means that this argument is invalid. Now, can somebody use common sense to tell us why the argument is invalid? Hannah.
Okay, Doc. If we are saying that the minor premise is affirming the consequence, it is invalid because the consequence here is he passes by my mother's house, and then the minor premise is today he passed by my mother's house. So you're affirming that same thing. Yes, that's how I believe. So it has to affirm why how come, so what happened when he passed by your mother's house? So it means that he went to town, something like that. Okay.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay, so today he passed by my mother's house. A number of people have said it affirms the consequence, and someone has explained, and as that Sarah has explained, that it affirms because it is repeating what we can see in the major premise, which is correct. So that means it is affirming the consequence. Yeah, but what I am asking, why is the argument invalid? Why is the argument invalid from a common sense point of view? We already know by the rule for deductive reasoning that the argument is invalid. Now we have to find out we have to cross-check with our common sense why the argument is invalid.
Sir, please, I'm trying. So it says anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. So the condition is anytime he goes to town. So if he goes to town, then he will pass by my mother's house. But then the second premise says today he passed by my mother's house. If we are using common sense, the condition for if he goes to town is not covered. So like this in this sense is basically saying he passed by my mother's house without implying from whether he went to town whether he went to town or whether he didn't go to town. It's basically saying he passed by my mother's house. So I mean the condition is if he goes to town. So if he goes to town, it is only when he goes to town that he will pass by my mother's house. But
Yeah, so
then the
that's
second premise is
that is where the problem comes from. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. But he didn't say that whenever he passes by my mother's house, he's
he
going to
goes to
town.
town. Yes.
Right, let me answer.
So we
Hello.
can substitute the
So,
words with alternative. We can substitute it with alternative names and places. So
please, I want to
anytime,
answer the question.
yeah.
Like,
Go ahead.
he may pass the mother's side, but he's not going to the town.
Yeah, so that's what I'm looking at. If we substitute the words, probably the problem will be clearer. Anytime Mahama goes to Accra, he passes Legon. Anytime Mahama goes to Accra, he passes Legon. Today he passed Legon, so he must be going to Accra. So why is the argument invalid? So the statement anytime Mahama goes to Accra, he must have passed Legon doesn't tell you that anytime he passed Legon, he must have gone to Accra. The two statements are different. So that is the hidden information that is missing. Anytime he goes to Accra, he passes Legon. Doesn't mean that anytime he passes Legon, he went to Accra. So today he passed Legon and went to Circle. So that is the problem. When someone says that anytime he goes to Accra, he must pass Legon, he didn't tell you that anytime he passes Legon, he must have gone to Accra. And that is the problem we have with the fallacy of denying the antecedent and the fallacy of affirming the consequence. When somebody says that all Ghanaians are Africans, the person did not tell you that all Africans are Ghanaians. The two statements are different. The fact that all Ghanaians are Africans doesn't mean that all Africans are Ghanaians. So when you say somebody is not an Ghanaian, and then you conclude that because he's not a Ghanaian, he's not an African. You see, you land in uncertainty. You land in uncertainty because Africa is larger than Ghana. So there will be uncertainty when you say somebody is not an African just because he's not a Ghanaian. Or if somebody must pass through Lagos to go to Accra, there is uncertainty when you conclude he must be in Accra just because he passed through Lagos. So if there is a case and we are looking for Mahama, and then we have information he passed through Lagos, then you rush to Accra to go and look for him. So that's an uncertainty. You may go there and he's not there. Probably he's at Seko. Just because he passed through Lagos doesn't mean he's at Accra. So what you need to remember is that the consequence is always logically like that, because usually that's and that's now let's correctly. Yeah. Nama, what's I'm trying to pronounce the name. Somebody's hand was raised, but now Gloria's hand is raised. Gloria, what do you want to say? Yeah, Gloria, your hand is raised.
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, please. The example you gave, you gave an example. You were like, Mama. Anytime Mama goes to Accra, he passed through Legon. So with that, Accra was stated in there, and Legon was stated in there. But the question with this one, the brain teaser, this one, you said anytime he goes to town. So he passes through my mother's house. The last part is he went to town. So it's still town, the town is still in there. But the other example, he said he went to Accra. Anytime he goes to Accra, he passes through Legon.
No, the Mahama's own, anytime Mahama goes to Accra, he passes through Legon. So today, Mahama passed through Legon.
Okay.
So he went to Accra. That's the correct thing.
Okay.
So I was saying that if we are looking for Mahama and we know that he passes through Legon whenever he goes to Accra, today we receive information that he has passed through Legon. Because we know that he must pass through Legon to go to Accra, we'll begin to go to Accra to go and search for him. But you may go there and he's not there.
Okay.
Yeah, so anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today he passed by my mother's house, so he goes to town. But it's possible he passed by my mother's house and visited his girlfriend next door. His girlfriend may be living next door, so he just passed by my mother's house and visited her.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
Sarah, your hand is raised. Yeah, somebody's hand is raised.
Please, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Please, does it mean that if it is a conditioned statement, then the argument will end up being a valid argument?
No, the argument is the same whether it is a conditional or categorical version. The conditional version is just to help you see the argument better. In this particular argument, the major premise already looks like a conditional. It's already somehow a conditional. So that already even makes it clearer.
Please, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the other question, you were like, because the first time they said anytime he goes to Accra, he passes by my mother's house. And the second one, they were like, where's that? He passed by my mother's house. And the last one was so he went to town. So he said that means this one is invalid. So what if for the second one they were like, anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Okay, so the third one was he went to town, so he passed by my mother's house. Does that mean it would have been valid?
Now you have to raise the volume of your microphone. Check your microphone and raise it a bit more. I need to hear the last part of your statement. So you were saying today he passed by my mother's house. Does it mean that he did what?
And I said the second one that they said today he passed by my mother's house. What if it was he went to town, so he passed by my mother's house? But that means the question would have been valid.
I still didn't get it, but the thing is that I was saying that if he must pass by my mother's house, when he's going to town, it doesn't mean that anytime he passed by my mother's house, he goes to town. Now, premise one is only informing you that passing your mother's house is his only route to going to town. But it did not inform you that going to town is the only destination whenever he passes by my mother's house. So that is why you may be confusing the two pieces of information. So if today he passed by my mother's house, and then the conclusion is so he went to town, you'll be tempted to think the argument is correct. But that is because you have not specified the information in the major premise. Now, if you look at the major premise, it doesn't give you enough information for the conclusion.
He says so if the major premises give, a real something for the conclusion, that it means the statement is valid.
The problem is that I can't hear you very well. Let me put on my. Give me 2 seconds. Let me put on my my earpiece. Okay, so now my earpiece is on. And you were asking a question about the minor premise and the conclusion. So I want you to repeat the question, please.
It's like, so if the major premise, if the major premise like has a real something for the concluding part, doesn't mean the statement is valid.
If the major premise, if you mean if the major premise is yeah, and there are some noises in the background. So all right, so you can text me your question so that I will deal with it. So now let's move on to the next slide. So let's answer these questions correctly. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent, true or false? Yeah, Seme.
Say false. False.
Yeah, false. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent, false. So that's correct. Question 2. We deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent, true or false? Is that Abdul? Abdul Wahab?
Yes, yes, it's true.
Yeah, true. That's good. All right.
Hello.
So question 3. Yeah, so number 2 is true. That's correct. So number 3, we deduce correctly when we deny the consequent, true or false?
True.
Said true. Said please is true.
Okay. Okay, good. So number 4, we deduce correctly when we affirm the consequent, true or false?
False.
False.
Okay, good. Good. So let's move on. Let's check this one before we round up. Validity versus soundness. Validity versus soundness. So we have validity and we also have soundness. Not every valid argument is a sound argument. Let's look at the reason why. The 4 types of deductive syllogism are 4 ways of making deductively valid arguments. Now, a valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. That's what makes it valid, that the premises are logically consistent with the conclusion. It's enough to make an argument valid. The premises of a valid argument necessarily imply its conclusion in the manner that it's impossible to deny the inference without running into self-contradiction. So what you need for validity is that the argument follows the rule for deductive reasoning. Simple. So we're going to see that an invalid argument is an argument whose premises do not logically imply the conclusion. So the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not that of logical necessity. You can proceed to deny the conclusion of an invalid argument without contradicting yourself. Now, the formal fallacies are invalid arguments. So the fallacies we have seen, the fallacy of denying the antecedent, the fallacy of affirming the consequent, the 2 hypothetical fallacies, all those fallacies, we call them formal fallacies. The fallacies we encounter in deductive reasoning, we call them the formal fallacies. From next week, we'll start seeing the informal fallacies. So later on, you compare formal and informal fallacies. Now let's look at valid but sound. This argument is valid, but it's not sound. All human beings are immortal. All human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. This argument is valid because it's a correct modus ponens. It affirms the antecedent, so that makes it a valid argument. But it is not sound because one of the premises is not true. So there is falsehood in one of the premises. So although the argument is valid, it is not sound. So we say the argument is valid but unsound. Okay. Abdul Wahab, your hand is raised. To ask Abdul Wahab. Okay. So valid but not sound. Let's look at another example. This is another example. All men are mammals. All men are mammals. All mammals must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. All mammals must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. Now, so this is also, first of all, what kind of argument is this? What kind of argument is this? You can change the words to symbols, so you can see what kind of argument it is. So man is A, mammal is B. Man is A, mammal is B. And then getting killed is C. All men are mammals, all A are B. All mammals must get killed. All B are C. Is hypothetical. All the others, that's hypothetical. All A are C. That's hypothetical. So it is a valid argument. But is it a sound argument? No, because there's falsehood in one of the premises. It's not, premise 2 is not true. So the argument is valid but unsound. Let's look at invalid argument with true conclusion. Invalid argument with true conclusion. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. Now, first of all, this is a single sentence, although it is long, but it's a single sentence. If you check the sentence, you can divide it into two. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization is one part of the sentence. It can even be a sentence on its own. Because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another part of another part of the sentence. In fact, it can stand on its own. So you have like two sentences in one. You can see the first part of the sentence is technically the conclusion. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization is technically the conclusion. And then the second part is technically the premise. So you have a conclusion followed by a premise. And the two of them are joined together by the word because. Now, this is one of those arguments with a single premise. It's a single premise argument. And the conclusion comes before the premise. Now, is the conclusion true? Democracy is better than other forms of political organization. Everybody believes it's true, so we regard it as true. Democracy is better. What about the second part? Is it true? Because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. That one cannot even be verified, and I don't think it's possible. There's nothing like citizens in one country being holier than citizens in another country. You have both holy and unholy people in all societies. So the second part is not true. Now, so this argument has a true conclusion, but a false premise. So we say it is an invalid argument with a true conclusion. Now, the true conclusion alone does not make an invalid argument correct. Before now, you must have been seeing a lot of arguments with true conclusions, but what you didn't check is to know whether the argument itself is valid. Especially in politics, partisan politics, one political party versus another political party, allegations and counter-allegations between them, you'll be seeing a lot of fallacies. You could see invalid arguments with true conclusions. But those arguments are meant to deceive people. Just because they have true conclusions doesn't mean the arguments are correct. Then you have valid and sound. To be sound, all the premises in a valid argument must be true. All men are mortal, Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So the argument affirms the antecedent, Peter is a man. It affirms the antecedent, so it is valid. It is also sound because all the premises are true. So we say the argument is valid and sound. So we have three forms. We have valid and sound, valid and unsound. We also have invalid and unsound. So let's repeat them with other examples. Valid and sound. All snakes are rats. That's correct. All cobra is a snake. That's correct. And it affirms the antecedent. Therefore, cobra is a reptile. So the argument is a valid modus ponens. It's also sound because all the statements in the argument are correct and true. Okay, so it's valid and sound. Valid but unsound. All snakes are reptiles. That's correct. Mosquitoes are snakes. That's wrong. That's false. Therefore, mosquitoes are reptiles. Now, all snakes are reptiles. Mosquitoes are snakes. That affirms the antecedent. So the argument is valid because it affirms the antecedent. But it is unsound because premise 2 is false. We can have both invalid and unsound, which is a double jeopardy. All snakes are reptiles, which is true. Mosquitoes are reptiles. That's false. And it is also affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent is invalid. So it's an argument that affirms the consequent. Therefore, mosquitoes are snakes. The argument is invalid because it affirms the consequent. It's also unsound because one of the premises is not true. Is an invalid but sound argument possible? No. An invalid argument is also unsound, even if the premises and conclusion are all true. All Ghanaians are Africans. Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. Now, all of these statements may be true, but the argument is invalid. It affirms the consequent, so it is invalid. Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. If you want to find out whether Kofi is a Ghanaian, is it by just confirming he's an African? No. You don't find out whether Kofi is a Ghanaian by just confirming he's an African. If you confirm he's an African, then it could be from any of the African countries. So the confirmation as an African is an invalid way of determining whether Kofi is a Ghanaian. If, for instance, somebody arrives at the airport, he calls himself Kofi, and then the immigration officials are trying to confirm he's a Ghanaian. They see that his color is black. So they say, oh, this is an African, so he must be a Ghanaian. How do you determine that type of process? Is it valid? The guy could be a Jamaican or one of these black Americans, change their names to Kofi, and then come to Ghana. And just because he has black skin, you confirm that he's a Ghanaian. So that's why the argument is invalid. You don't determine that he's a Ghanaian by just confirming he's an African. So he may actually be a Ghanaian, but that kind of discovery is by accident. You didn't find it out the right way. So an invalid argument can never be a sound argument. It's not a valid argument. So the technicality, validity is needed for soundness. Validity is needed for soundness, but soundness is not needed for validity. All that validity requires is to follow the rule for deductive reasoning. It is either a mod, if it is a modus ponens, tollens, hypothetical syllogism, or disjunctive reasoning, then it is valid. So soundness is not really needed for validity. Some arguments are valid but not true. On the other hand, soundness itself needs both validity and truth. Now, let's relax with some exercises. Identify the missing premise in each of the following deductive arguments. So, these arguments are supposed to compose of 3 statements, but there are only 2 statements. So, identify the missing premise. All military men play football. Bob plays football. What's the missing premise? Someone can answer that right away. All military men play football. Bob plays football. What's the missing premise? Abdul Wahab.
Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man. That's correct. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals.
So it means that all human beings are mammals.
All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. All human beings are mammals. So that's correct.
Mammals.
All human beings are mammals. That's good. Okay, so answer correctly. Which fallacy is committed by the following? So what fallacy is this? All A's are C's, all B's are C's. Therefore, all A's are B's.
All A's are C, all B's are C. No, these are me.
So what answer is that? Okay, so answer it right away. Who wants to answer it? Derek. Is that Derek Ofosu? All A's are C's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. What fallacy is that?
Sir, please, it's invalid.
No, what fallacy is it? What particular fallacy is it?
Hypothetical synonym.
Yeah, so you would rather call it hypothetical fallacy. When you say hypothetical syllogism, you are implying the correct one. So call it hypothetical fallacy rather than the hypothetical syllogism. All right.
Okay,
describe
sir.
the following.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, describe the following arguments. Describe the following arguments. Or just tell us what kind of argument this is. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European, so Ben is my friend. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. Now, the simplified version is the second one. So I would suggest you work with the second one. No European is my friend. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. So check it and determine what kind of argument is it. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European, therefore Ben is my friend. So is that Sarah? Yeah, so I thought someone's hand had been raised. Okay, so if no one answers it, I'm going to take it up.
So, can you say a valid argument?
No, I'm asking what kind of argument is this? I'm not asking whether it's valid or invalid, but what type of argument is it?
Sir, please, it's a disjunction argument.
Disjunction? You mean the either or?
Yes, please, because the second one is trying to say that no Europeans is my friend. Ben is not an European, but Ben is my it literally means that if Ben is not an European, then it means that Ben is actually my friend.
Yeah, but remember that the disjunctive arguments contain either or in the major premise. So you can see that there's no either or in the major premise of this one. So you still need to determine. So that already tells you that it's not a disjunctive. You need to determine which type among the other types.
So please, I think
yes,
is modus ponens.
Modus ponens. Okay, so explain why it is a modus ponens. Give us the explanation.
No European is my friend. Ben is not an European. Ben is my friend. So Ben, no European is my friend. So my friends are not Europeans. Therefore, Ben is my friend because Ben is not an European.
Okay, that's fine. So another explanation is that the major premise is negative. It's saying something negative about Europeans, about the antecedent. And then the minor premise is also saying something negative about the antecedent, Europeans. So if both of them, if both premises are saying something negative about the antecedent, Europeans, it means that the minor premise is actually affirming the major one. Remember, we said that two negatives combine to give you a positive. So this is a case of affirming the antecedent, which is a modus ponens. So that answer is correct. This is the end of the class. Next week, we shall do inductive reasoning. And if there is any question on a particular item we did, just a particular item, then we can sort it out right now. But if your question is that you don't understand the entire class or an entire section of the class, then you would need to watch the recording, which I hope to upload either this night or in the morning tomorrow. So now,
sir,
yes,
sir, please, will the recording be in the group or it will be on Sakai?
Yeah, it should be on both. And that your tutor has been sending on WhatsApp.
Sir, please, if it will be on
the
WhatsApp,
recording
then
on WhatsApp.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
WhatsApp
so you should be getting on WhatsApp as. Yeah, so it should be on both the Sakai and the WhatsApp. So if you don't see it in one, you check it in the other one. So right now I'm going to proceed to
but the
stop
WhatsApp
the recording.
Group, the one you are inside.
Yes. Yeah, I mean the one
like
I
the
just
WhatsApp
discovered
group, the
this
one you are
afternoon.
inside. There's the previous class we had. Okay, please. Yes. Except the last week recording that you made, you didn't upload it on the WhatsApp platform.
Yeah, we haven't uploaded. We have not even retrieved it. At the end of the meeting, we were waiting for the recording to come on Microsoft Teams, but it didn't. So we're wondering why we couldn't. Normally, at the end of the meeting, the recording will appear on the Teams page. So later on, we're going to invite into the comment section of Microsoft Teams to see if we can find it. So that would need a stronger internet infrastructure. But we hope to do that at least by next week. That of today is what I'm hoping we get, and then we give it to you either today. I think the internet today is quite weak, but we hope we can do it early tomorrow. All right.
Oh,
So now
okay,
the
sir.
recording is stopping. All right.